the Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today we are joined by political scientist Paul Buchanan and we will analyse revelations that the People's Republic of China has further developed missile silos in the northwestern desert. What's China's motivation here? How does this fit with proliferation of nuclear silos in the West? And how do great powers enforce their nuclear deterrence dogma and strategy in 2021 compared to when the first Cold War was chilling the world's expectations of longevity? And what of new nuclear powers like Israel, North Korea and others, with their lack of ability to sustain a total annihilation attack? Do they pose a real first strike threat? And if so, is nuclear deterrence rendered an obsolete strategy as a consequence? And what of Aotearoa New Zealand? Does its nuclear-free position that placed it as an independent from so-called protections of the United States nuclear umbrella, now does that keep us safe from becoming a target? Or has the weaponising of space, where the practice, for example, in New Zealand of RocketLab sending payloads of US military tech into orbit, does that bring New Zealand into scope and as a target? Okay, so let's cross to Paul and we're going to discuss all of these issues and more. And let's see if Paul, yes, he's on the line. Good afternoon, Paul.
Good, Selwyn. Good to see you again, my friend.
Yeah, tēnā koe, Paul. Ka pai to have you on the program again today. Paul, can you take us through in the first instance what is happening in China? We understand from reconnaissance and intelligence that there is an escalation in the number of nuclear weapon silos that are being built in the northwestern desert areas of China. Can you take us through this? Why is it occurring? What's it all about? And what does this signal to other opposing forces around the world?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So essentially, China is expanding the land-based component of its nuclear triad. The triad, of course, are sea-launched missiles, air-launched missiles or dumb bombs, and the land-based component, which consists of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs for short, that are shot out of missiles. And the construction that has caught the eye of Western observers is occurring in near the city of Yunnan in Gansu province, which is in the middle northwest of the People's Republic of China. They also have facilities in Outer Mongolia. And the difference being is the facilities in Outer Mongolia, which are also being expanded, have an earlier version of an intercontinental missile known as the Dongfeng 26, DF-26 for short. The missiles that are going to be thrown from the Gansu province will be the DF-41, which is the latest edition of their ICBMs. And these ICBMs are intercontinental because they have an effective reach of 15,000 kilometers, 13 to 15,000 kilometers. Intermediate range missiles extend up to 5,500 kilometers. So there's a considerable difference between intermediate range and long range missiles. Now, what's interesting is that these missiles in Gansu are believed to be what they call MIRVed, which means multiple independent reentry vehicles. There'll be up to 10 warheads on each of these boosters. And what happens is the missile goes up into low space orbit, comes down, and upon reentry, the nose cone releases these various nuclear warheads, which have what are known as throw weights, that is the amount of kilotonnage or megatonnage each one is going to carry. and they target separate targets. They may, for reasons of redundancy, put two on any given target, let's say a hardened structure. But nevertheless, what that means is that the 150 missile silo holes that the West believes are being built in the desert can have up to 1,500 missiles, warheads on them. There is the possibility that the Chinese will play a bit of a shell game. And
yeah, I was just going to pick that. I was just going to pick this up. So this was a position that was put forward over the last week by Carnegie think tank in the United States, where they're saying that it may be that the building of the silos are not actually all filled with nuclear weapons, and that it's perhaps a strategy of over presenting the position that the People's Republic of China may have with respect to nuclear capabilities, similar, as I understand it, Paul, from what Carnegie was saying, to where the United States was and what it was doing in practice with cell silos back in the 1970s, although the technology is obviously a lot different with respect to the weapons. Can you talk us through that? Is that a likely situation, or do you think it's overly ambitious or optimistic?
Well, there's two sides to that coin. The first one, in terms of an aggressor targeting those missile sites, we have to remember that the accuracy of targeting in this day and age is far, far more sophisticated than it was in the 1970s and the 1980s. And I say that because there's a concept known as circular error probable, CEP, which is the radius around the target in which the warhead's going to fall. In the 70s, the circular error probable was within a mile of an enemy silo, for example. And so you needed a warhead with a much bigger blast radius in order to hit that target effectively. Nowadays, you don't need those large warheads simply because the CEPs are down to within meters. A US ICBM, the Titan III, I think is their latest version, can fly 13,000 kilometers and land within 10 meters of a designated target. So the Chinese are aware of this, and they're aware that the US could take out their missile silos with one nuclear weapon. See, normally a targeter has to think of redundancy and say, if I can't kill it with the first strike, I need to come in with a second warhead. So those MIRV packages that the Americans have tend to target hardened targets like missile silos with two warheads each. Targeting accuracy has gotten to the point where they may not need to do so. So the shell game may work, but only if the U.S. is using rudimentary detection technologies and looking at the lids of the silos rather than using radioactive sniffing devices. Let's just say their technologies have advanced a little bit. Now, from the Chinese perspective, you're investing a lot of resources in building these silos in the first place. And if there are underground railroads tying these silos together so you can actually move the missiles rapidly between sites and what have you, then playing the shell game may pay off. It may allow you under attack to relocate your missiles and fire them before the entire field is obliterated. And I will point out two concepts that are very important here. The first one is counter-force versus counter-value strikes. In the old days of mutual assured destruction, the nuclear targeters targeted cities. Those were considered counter-value. You killed cities, and that way the opponent would surrender because, like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, their main urban centers were being obliterated. But in this day and age, mutual assured destruction no longer obtains for the big nuclear powers. They do what is called counter-force targeting. And counter-force targeting is you kill the command and control centers of the enemy, you kill his missile silos, you kill his submarine bases, and you leave the cities standing because you need somebody to negotiate with. So you show your ability to kill them, and they cannot effectively retaliate, and then you hold them hostage until they negotiate favorable terms. Well, the Chinese are putting these missiles out there to prevent a U.S. first strike. You see, the United States...
This is where I was going to get to. Why now? There's a lot of killing, a lot of risk. The deterrent argument obviously brings across into its core, if you like, huge global risk, not just to one's domestic state or state interest, national interests. So why now? Why would the Chinese ratchet this up? We know from the context, timeline analysis, and all the news, everybody knows that there's been a trade war that is enduring. It began under the Donald Trump administration in China, and clearly in the United States they can see the reasons why that trade war existed when they came in under the Biden administration, and they're keeping it on in different forms, but it's going on. But before we go into the whys, we just take a break. We'll just look at what the United States Secretary of State's Blinken, his spokesperson, is saying earlier this week on exactly this finding with respect to China. I'll just bring this up.
But we intend to maintain...
This is Reuters.
I think what is fair to say is that these reports and other developments suggest that the PRC's nuclear arsenal will grow more quickly and to a higher level than perhaps previously anticipated. This buildup, it is concerning. It raises questions about the PRC's intent. And for us, it reinforces the importance of pursuing practical measures to reduce nuclear risks. Despite what appears to be PRC obfuscation, this rapid buildup has become more difficult to hide. And it highlights how the PRC appears, again, to be deviating from decades of nuclear strategy based around minimum deterrence.
So if we look at that, Paul, both you and I know, and many people know that follow issues relating to the People's Republic of China and its engagement with foes and allies, that it has a strong principled position with respect to its military and military build-up of defence of its motherland, defence of the mainland China, and obviously South China Sea and the Hong Kong territories and all administrative territories, and also Taiwan, Mongolia, Tibet. So the footprint is large. Are we seeing a change from that with the reach of these types of missiles that we suspect are going to be in these silos? Are we seeing a change from that there is a very, very strong global deterrence argument coming out that is perhaps beyond purely a defence response? And is it one where there is a danger where China perceives it's weaponising itself to deter a preemptive strike from the United States, where something can go wrong and the missiles actually fly from the east instead of the west?
Well, I think it's a good point. I think it is the advancing of a global deterrence strategy, much the way the U.S. and the Russians have. Now, let's be very clear. Up until this point, China has been estimated to have about 350 nuclear warheads distributed through the three components of the triad. The air-based triad, they no longer dump bombs. They use cruise missiles that are nuclear tipped as standoff weapons. But the important part of the triad for the Chinese as well as other countries is the submarine fleet. Nuclear tipped submarine fleet. They have a version of the DF-26 called the JL-2, I believe, which is a sea-launched intercontinental missile. But they don't have enough of them to overcome the U.S. attack submarine fleet. See, attack submarines are not nuclear tipped, but their sole purpose in life is to kill nuclear tipped submarines. So a Chinese boat will go out into the open waters of the Pacific, and more often than not, very likely he'll have an American boat right up his rear end, ready to kill it at the first sign of any trouble. So the Chinese are doing what they feel necessary to do, which is exercising their sovereign right to build up that land-based component, because out where they're going now, it is difficult for American missiles to reach them. They're further into the hinterland than ever before, whereas before their nuclear forces were along the eastern coast of China. Now they're pushing them way in. Again, they're in outer Mongolia. They don't fear the Russians. They do have some concerns about the Indians, but they can overwhelm the Indians with what they have already. And so they're building that land-based component as a deterrent because, among many other things, even if the Americans were to succeed in hitting their missile silo farms, they would still have enough in reserve at sea and then in their intermediate range missile forces to hurt U.S. interests, both at home and in the near abroad. So I think the Chinese are doing this in part because once they get to an equal level with the United States, and again, they're less concerned about the Russians, but the Russians will likely have a say in this, then you might be able to negotiate trilateral strategic arms limitation talks, negotiate agreements, whereas the Chinese are treated as equals. Again, they're not party to any strategic or intermediate range missile agreements whatsoever. Now, if I remember correctly, under the SALT agreements between the Russians and the Americans, the Russians have about 5,000 warheads, the Americans have about 3,800. And those agreements there's two components. Agreements on the limitation of boosters, so the missiles themselves, and then limitations on the amount of warheads that can go on any one missile up to a certain ceiling. The U.S. has agreed to 3,800. The Russians have 5,000. The reason for that is the U.S. has more sophisticated targeting technologies. So the Russians understand that they don't need the redundancies that the Russians did when they negotiated these deals. These deals, by the way, are from the 1980s, so they're rapidly becoming obsolescent.
Yeah, and just on the numbers, the proportions of numbers kind of change a little bit depending on where the information is sourced. But I'd say the proportions are close. Like some are saying this week, information coming out of the United States are saying that the Russians are sitting around 6,000, the United States sitting just under the 5 or around the 5,000. So the proportions, and it may be that they're counting different types of weaponry in there too, like in the tactical nuke areas that perhaps is outside the scope of some of the intercontinental. So just a minor point, but just for the audience's sake, if they see different numbers, that's what Paul's talking about here.
Yeah. I mean, you could be well right. I mean, I may have my numbers off, but these were all negotiated in the 80s under the technologies of the time, and we've advanced a lot since the late 1980s, and so it may be time. Upon expiry of the current SALT II agreements to invite the Chinese, and the Chinese have just made themselves a place at the table by constructing these advanced missile silos. Now, on the question of the age of agreements, let's also remember that the Non-Proliferation Treaty is from 1970. And again, China was not a signatory, so it's not violating.
5 nations, wasn't it, at that stage?
Right. When they signed the NPT, they recognized 5 nuclear states: China, Russia, France, the UK, and the United States. Since then, India, Israel, and North Korea have joined the nuclear club, whether we like it or not, on any one particular.
Israel doesn't admit to it, but it's accepted amongst those that analyze such things that it does possess.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's but it's an open secret.
Yep.
We also have to remember that Pakistan has intermediate range ballistic missiles, so not ICBMs, but they're nuclear tipped and they're aimed at India. So the proliferation regime of the 1970s has failed to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapon states. And perhaps it's time for a review and revision of the NPT to take into account the modern technologies that are being brought. And the one that has me the most concerned is the whole push towards miniaturization.
Yeah. And this is something further than tactical nuclear weaponry, isn't it?
Right. Although
Yeah.
it's a good point you remind me of that, because we're in an age now where everything's being miniaturized. And, we've got insect drones now for battlefield reconnaissance. You mentioned space, and of course, RocketLab launches what are known as nano satellites. So satellites that are 10 kilos, that have the capability that satellites, of 2 tons used to have in the 1980s. And so we're moving to miniaturization, and here's where the tactical part comes in. It seems to me that a lot of the NPT and the arms limitation agreements that are in force today do not take into account what are known as battlefield nukes. The so-called neutron bomb was one of those, which can be fired from artillery, which can be dropped cruise missile fashion from attack aircraft. And if you miniaturize and you're able to keep the same payloads with lighter and lighter delivery vehicles, be they artillery shells or wing-mounted missiles, the urge to use them in battle increases in the measure of the desperation of the commanders who have access to them, and increases in the measure that nations see existential threats in small wars that may involve battlefield defeats if such weapons are not used to the honor of the country, to, those things. Let's be very clear. The weak link or Achilles heel of any complex organization, institutions, and otherwise are the human beings that reside within them and operate systems. So, one commander faced with the possibility of catastrophic conventional losses, having access to a miniaturized battlefield nuclear weapon, especially in a decentralized command and control system, could well launch one, and then we have the opening of Pandora's box. So,
and escalation, and the concerns there too is mission creep. If such the use of such things, even DU or depleted uranium being used up in the Gulf War, for example, the concerns were that it became the new normal. That where does that kind of go from there? And like what you're pointing out here, the alarm bells go off, don't they? There's the point of view of, like you've addressed there, of a mistake being made, the human error elements, and then escalation. But the new normal and mission creep is also another part, isn't it, of concern?
It is, and it's interesting that you mentioned DU, because scavengers collecting, the discards of depleted uranium munitions have within the possibilities and low-tech possibilities of making dirty bombs, because you're using the shell casings and whatnot that are radioactive, and you can turn them. And let's just say that there are some indications that in Anbar province, people connected to ISIS have been trying to source DU discards and shell casings for exactly that purpose. So, the unintended consequences of moving into even the most low-grade applications of nuclear force,
It's dangerous. Dangerous all over. So let's look at, the smaller powers, nuclear powers, for example, North Korea, for example, Israel in its own sense, perhaps India and Pakistan. But let's look at those at this point, Paul, where their capabilities are obviously not up to the same level of strike abilities as what some of the giant nuclear powers are that you've detailed here. That there is a risk, perhaps, from a common sense analysis point of view on these, that they may actually prefer, as states, a first strike strategic plan. To get out there and let's hone in on North Korea in this. It seems quite clear that that is a high risk. What does that say to the arguments around nuclear deterrence that have been argued, and some would say successfully, although personally I don't buy into that, but would say successfully amongst the giant nuclear powers, the top 5, for example. Does first strike risk render it obsolete? Where does it fit into that argument, into that doctrine or dogma?
Well, that's a really good point, because for years we had the primacy of the second strike logic. And what that basically was is, if you engage in a first strike, let's say on the Russians, you will not be able to kill all of their nuclear forces at once. In fact, even a wave attack will not kill their submarine forces and what have you. So they will have the ability to attack you back via second strike, and that will be devastating to you. So that was the premise of mutual assured destruction, and it remains the premise under the counter-force logics of the present day amongst the big players. So between the UK, France, China, Russians, and the United States, that's pretty much the logic. But you've made a very good point. If you're a small state with limited nukes, let's say Israel and North Korea, the circumstances of India and Pakistan are very unique. It could well be that these countries see value in striking first, and the Israelis have a reputation for preemptive wars. The idea being is, why wait for a mass conventional attack, in the face of an existential threat? And I believe that many Israelis do think Iran is an existential threat, and vice versa. And so to them, the idea that you would get out in front and nuke this opponent. See, right now we're in a dangerous moment, because the Israelis could go and launch a nuclear attack on Iran before Iran has the ability to retaliate. Will the Russians come to Iran's rescue? Probably not. Will the Chinese want to risk nuclear war with the United States because Israel nuked Tehran? But that's the issue, is they don't have the ability, because of the small landmass and the fact that they have a limited number of nuclear warheads, to ride out a first strike from someone else and then deploy a second strike. So North Korea in particular, given the odd leadership that it has, they're rational, they're not crazy, but they have concepts of national pride and honor that may indicate to them that they should try to put a strike on the U.S. mainland because of economic starvation, things that only the leadership would think would be sensical, and launch a first strike, even though they know that they'll be obliterated. That's possible. Again, it's the human being and the machine that is, that's the area of vulnerability. So I think that whereas the big players are, they share the same rationality. I believe that India and Pakistan basically share the same rationality, which is no first use.
Yeah.
It's these other actors who are coming in again, and we're miniaturizing things as we go along. So the ability to throw a nuclear tipped missile 5,000 kilometers away and hit a national enemy is a lot easier now than it used to be. I would argue that given the sophistication of conventional weapons, you don't need nuclear weapons to make a point across distance, but nuclear weapons have a symbolic effect, a psychological effect, which is precisely why the bigger players have tried to avoid using them. I'm not entirely sure that particularly the militant or hardliners in both Israel and Iran share the same logic as the great powers, and if they ever get to control the levers of their respective nuclear forces, again, Israel has operational nuclear forces, warheads on missiles today. Iran may get them fairly soon, or may have them hidden. We don't know for sure. But if the wrong people get a hold of those things and think they'd rather go down in flames than suffer, humiliation at the heart of this enemy, then we may have an entire different set of logics come into play. And if that's the case, the escalatory potential, given the alliance networks surrounding these countries, literally goes through the ceiling.
Yeah, and some of those that are survivors from the world stage of a previous era, the Cold War era, like Mikhail Gorbachev a year ago, where he was painting a picture of intensifying risk around this time. Obviously heralding, trying to put his voice out there to saying, start thinking other ways beyond the top five nuclear deterrence type of arguments. Obviously the concerns were becoming palpable, and he was obviously already also talking about risk from and to the Russian Federation and the current configurations.
I mean,
Paul.
I was just going to say the one good piece of news here is that because the great powers are all focused on counter force targeting, that is, kill hardened targets, military targets, and leave the city standing so you can negotiate with them. Any confrontation between them will probably be short and sweet to make the point, we can kill your hard targets, now let's talk. I don't think it'll come to that because they share that logic of deterrence. The question is this: do people like the Israelis or the North Koreans, do they adopt counter force strategic postures? And I would say no. They are going to go counter value. They don't have the sophisticated technologies to target hardened command and control sites, and so they're going to try to kill cities, the old-fashioned way. And if that's the case, that's such a heinous crime, a crime against humanity, that, again, the escalatory possibility of counter value strikes is simply larger than the escalatory possibility of counter force strikes. And we need to keep that in mind, and maybe perhaps argue, on our respective sides, the Chinese talking to the North Koreans and the Americans talking to the Israelis, say, well, listen, if you are going to deploy your nukes, could you aim at military sites and not at cities? It's bad enough you're going to do this, but if you keep it limited to military damage and you stay away from the large urban centers, there's a little measure of grace in doing so, and maybe that a settlement can occur. Otherwise, if you kill cities and you leave the other countries' military standing, you'll have regional wars.
Yeah. I'll just bring in a comment that has come through with respect to our conversation just, say, 10 minutes ago on China. And it's coming from Liz, who comments off and on this program. I'll just add it to the broadcast here. And Liz says, China has no first use policy with regard to nuclear weapons, which the United States doesn't, meaning that the United States does have a first use or a preemptive strike strategy. And this is what we were talking about, weren't we, Paul? Is there a change that has been picked up with respect to China's position on exactly that point? So I think we canvassed it well at the time, but if you want to add anything to Liz's comments there, Paul, or comment there, Paul, it would be most welcome.
Yeah, no, Liz is right. I mean, the Chinese have behaved responsibly and said that their nuclear force is a deterrent force based on the second strike principle. And I don't think anything they're doing right now is setting them up for, to engage in first strikes on anybody. This is more designed to keep the United States, let's say, for example, in the event of a conflict with Taiwan, and the U.S. threatens to use its first strike capability. Well, building this missile silo farm out in the desert in the Northwest, the two missile silo farms out in the desert, make it a lot harder for the United States to succeed in a first strike venture. And I agree with Liz also. When Obama reiterated the refusal to disavow a first strike capability, I was really disappointed. I thought, no, you have an opportunity to make clear that you will only use these weapons if you're attacked. And you, Obama, a liberal man, a guy who won the Nobel Peace Award, are saying that you're not disavowing the potential use of a first strike, and that just seems to me to be backwards, to say the least.
Where do you
So
think Joe Biden would sit on that very question?
he will follow what exactly the same. In fact, he'll be worse than Obama because Joe Biden is more hawkish
Yeah.
on strategic issues than Obama was. In fact, if you think about it, Obama was very much influenced by Hillary Clinton, his Secretary of State, and Joe Biden, his Vice President, when it came to these big strategic military issues, and it led him down some bad paths. Let me just mention Syria with the red line in the sand, and then Libya, where they intervened for where there was nothing there that the United States had a stake in, and you can see the results in both places. Well, the architects of those approaches were not Obama per se, but Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. So no, Biden is going to continue the refusal to disavow a first strike capability. And of course, if that's the case, then it makes sense for nations like the Chinese to, build up their nuclear defenses in the event that someone in the United States decides that if Taiwan's attacked, the best thing to do is go nuclear on the Chinese mainland. It probably will not happen, but the Chinese can't afford to go on the assumption that the Americans will behave. What is it Reagan said? Trust but verify.
Yeah.
Well, the Chinese are doing a version of that.
Yeah, okay, I get it. The other thing too is just prior to the bilateral meeting between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, Biden was very persuasive in saying, "Don't get him wrong. The United States will retaliate with full force should it be threatened or perceive a threat in any way." So he is like what you say, and many in the United States, no doubt, would support that. He is much more hawkish, perhaps, than what some people may believe, but. Look, let's just come back, Paul, and just do a transition. We'll come back and we'll look at what all of this means, what it means. For countries like New Zealand down in the South Pacific that has enjoyed an independent policy with respect to becoming independent away from the nuclear umbrella strategy of defence that others like Australia have signed up to for many years. We'll just come back with that. Be right back. Yeah, welcome back, people, and Paul, welcome back too. So let's look at that. Like we know, Paul, in the 1980s we had a Labour-led government, or Labour government at that time, led by David Lange, where New Zealand put a line in the sand and it said, we will no longer be a part of this nuclear deterrence doctrine, this dogma. We will abandon that. We will become a nuclear-free state, and we do not expect nor encourage to have, as a part of our defence, New Zealand placed under the United States nuclear umbrella. There are many, I suppose even a generation has grown up believing that New Zealand's position in such things actually places it outside of threat, that places it to the side of becoming a target. With the weaponising of space, Paul, and with commercial operators like RocketLab, owned in large part now by the United States, putting into space payloads this year, in March to be specific, technologies that assisted the United States' ability in its military strategies and tactics, and its confidence that it can deploy and successfully assert through military means the United States' interests around the globe. Does that type of thing change the whole dynamic of where New Zealand stands or positions itself with respect to its own national defence and its own national security? Does that mean that New Zealand, in pure language, simple language, become a potential target should things go so wrong amongst the other powers around the world?
Well, it's a really good question, and I'll start by saying a small nation like New Zealand, and particularly a non-nuclear New Zealand, it was a very courageous thing to do in the 80s because there were consequences to that decision in terms of our military security, our intelligence relationships, and the like. But New Zealand is in a very good position to push for the updating of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The trouble there, and I would urge all New Zealand governments now and into the future to push for a upgrading of the NPT, given our bona fides as a non-nuclear state are so good. Focusing in on miniaturization, focusing in on the prevention of tactical nuclear weapons from ever being used via multilateral agreements. However, New Zealand, for the last 2 decades or more, has placed trade relationships and market-oriented economics before everything else.
Yeah.
There is no strategic vision anymore that does not bow to the primacy of trade. And so everything is skewed through that prism. When in
Our
fact
national interest is weighed by it, isn't it? There is a tendency, depending on what government is leading the charge in executive government in New Zealand, from our foreign affairs ministry, for example, to be divided between its diplomatic wing and its trade wing. And then the oscillation occurs with the National Party in particular, where it becomes trade obsessive. And the balance between those two wings of diplomatic wing and the trade wing, the trade overruns the whole thing, and then you see an oscillation back. So I'm just asserting that point to support what you're saying there, Paul, and it's a valid point, isn't it? And where does that place New Zealand right now?
Well, they've tried to, pull the pendulum a little bit back from the market-oriented policies of the previous national government, but again, this market primacy, because it envelops all of New Zealand's strategic logic. It is the first thing that whatever passes as strategic analysts in this country think about is the impact on trade. We're an export-dependent nation, blah, 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 blah. And I think it's led us down some very unpleasant holes. For example, sometimes trade has to be separated from security. Because the pursuit of trade can wind up jeopardizing security. And we may see this happening with the overdependence on China for trade. But let me give you an example. You mentioned RocketLab. RocketLab is touted as a great New Zealand success story. And RocketLab sold its project, its business model, on the fact that it was Kiwi, on the fact that it was number 8 wire, application and what have you. And what have we discovered? As it grew, RocketLab, is no longer a Kiwi company. It's majority owned by investment vehicles tied to the likes of Peter Thiel and other big venture billionaires. Its headquarters is in LA. Its assembly plant for the photon booster, because that's all they do is launch. They don't do the nose cone stuff. The assembly plant is here in Auckland, but the headquarters are in LA. They said they would not launch military payloads, and yet now we've discovered that after doing intelligence payloads paid by various U.S. military and intelligence agencies, they are now launching as yet not operational, but targeting payloads, real-time targeting satellites, so that the Americans...
What was its mission name? J Gunsmoke?
Yeah. J Gunsmoke.
Right.
J Gunsmoke is designed to kill people, to allow the Americans to kill people more effectively. That's what J Gunsmoke is all about. It was launched from the Mahia Peninsula. Now, if you're an adversary of the United States and you see this ongoing and you see the possibility of conflict in the future, then it behooves your strategic planners to take that site out. And so I have no doubts, this is speculation on my part, that there is a Chinese submarine with a cruise missile on it that has the Mahia Peninsula's name on it. Because you can take that site out with a conventional weapon. All you need to do is put, a 1,000-pound conventional payload on the end of a guided missile, and it hits the launch pad, and that's the end of that site.
Or in this day and age, it is very likely as well that a cyber attack could do the same thing. That you use all of that energy that sends these things up into space against itself. There are all sorts of ways and means, but the crucial element here is, are we a target? And you're saying the situation has developed where it's possible, on the scale of possible and probability, it's somewhere along that concerning line.
Well,
isn't it?
we've certainly made ourselves closer into being a target. But I'll point out something else with this RocketLab, because again, part of it is this absolute worship of entrepreneurship. Now, after it's been revealed that they are launching military payloads, that they no longer are a Kiwi company, the founder of RocketLab is saying, well, but we're going to be listed on the stock market in New York, and I'm going to make 100 of my employees millionaires overnight because I've given them stock options. Sounds really good, and the business pages of the local newspapers are all like, once again, RocketLab rewards. The fact is, the majority of the employees who will become instant millionaires are not Kiwis. There aren't enough rocket engineers and scientists in all of New Zealand to staff RocketLab. So who are these engineers who are going to become millionaires? They're Americans. It turns out the largesse is going offshore. And I think no one's stopping in the business pages to say, hold on a second. Yes, it's a really good success story. But the founder has lied to us all along about the nature of the payloads, who is paying for those payloads. He told the residents of the Mahia Peninsula, and by the way, that launch site is on leased Maori land. He never told the owners of that land that he was in the process of making them a target for someone, for actors who are hostile to U.S. interests. Never said anything. In fact, denied that there would be any military anything.
And I'd say at this point too that if those at RocketLab have a contrary view to what you've just detailed there, we'd encourage them to actually communicate with us so we can put it to our audience at any stage. So the point is taken here that it is a success story, that there are commercial and business elements to that success. Also the ingenuity in its initial stage of setting up that really did get New Zealand as a small island down in the South Pacific, where they're thinking, wow, we can do this kind of thing too. And New Zealand built a space within the governance kind of elements of it, a space entity as well. Their checks and balances. I heard RocketLab representatives on Radio New Zealand only about a month ago, where they are saying that New Zealand, in their view, had one of the best check processes or frameworks, where it takes a minister to sign off on various missions. Best that is around in the West, apparently. So, there's all of this, but it gets back to the premise, doesn't it, Paul, that the concerns are national security with respect to an independent nation such as New Zealand in this type of environment where things can go awry, and suddenly from that independent protective kind of strategy of which countries like New Zealand, or New Zealand in particular, has enjoyed over the last few decades, suddenly there's a target on everybody's head, and it's a concern, and we would expect these kind of debates in public to actually have a bit more energy around countries like New Zealand so that the public can be more informed about such things. And that's where we're coming from. With respect to where would you expect China to actually position from here, Paul, with what we've discussed through this whole program, do you believe, like that old song that was out of the Cold War that Sting sang, in that case it was with respect to the Russians, do the Russians love their children too? With China's position in the world, with the high risk stakes of a potential escalation in arms race in this new 2021 period that we find ourselves in. What do you think would be the rationale that would cool this down, where the two sides look at each other and think, okay, tip your hat, we've got the capabilities, but we're backing off? What would be the circumstances perhaps where sanity would prevail?
Well, I think at a strategic level, the United States needs to put its heads together with the Russians and invite the Chinese into the strategic arms limitation talks. You know, one thing that I find disturbing about international relations, particularly in the present moment, is there seems to be all this denying of the elephant in the room. So just because you don't like the character of a regime, you say they don't exist. And that's as true for, let's say, the Arab world not recognizing Israel, for the United States and South Korea not recognizing North Korea. North Korea has been in existence for over 60 years. It's not going anywhere. Israel's not going anywhere. So, but also not recognizing that Iran is a major regional player. We may not like the theocratic character of the regime, but they're here to stay. And so we need to face the fact that whether you like it or not, in international relations, sometimes you got to sit down and negotiate with actors that are not pleasant for the betterment of mankind. And certainly when it comes to nuclear weapons, you would think that the United States and the Russians could agree that the Chinese, because at some point maybe the Chinese and Russians will start looking at each other a little strange. There's history there. And say, you know what, we got to bring anyone who's got the capability to launch an ICBM, we should bring them into multilateral talks about how to diminish this. Then we need to invigorate that NPT. And in order to prevent, and again, focus on the technologies that are coming, not the technologies of the past, and push hard for the limitation of not only nuclear, but chemical and biological agents, which are all now being used once again, as recently as in Syria. Chemical weapons have been used with impunity. And try to not only reinvigorate the multilateral agreements prohibiting the dissemination of such weaponry, but also increasing the enforcement capability of multilateral organizations like the UN to deal with rogue actors who would contravene the agreement principles. Now, for New Zealand particularly, my understanding is that RocketLab's business model is using military launches when they're not economical in order to build the economies of scale to be able to launch 4 vehicles a month. I think that's his break-even point, $5 million a launch. At that point, it becomes commercially viable. And so RocketLab is using the American military and intelligence communities, with some scientific communities attached to them, to defray the costs of building that economy of scale. But then RocketLab is going to build, these are light boosters. It is going to build what is known as a medium weight booster that will go further into space, carry bigger payloads, and guess what? They're going to launch those not from New Zealand, but from a Air Force/CIA base in Virginia. And they will be purely dedicated to U.S. military and intelligence facilities. Well, I understand the business model. Use the American military in order to get up to speed for commercial launches. But let's just say that the Chinese are going to get a very different read of what Rocket Lab's all about, even after they move. And so I think that we need to think, you mentioned that, the minister has to sign off. The minister doesn't know what's in the nose cone until after the fact, if the Americans tell him. Stuart Nash, the minister for space,
he said that. He said he didn't know what was in them at one point when he was questioned by Ollie Neas. Yeah.
Well, that's just it. I was going to mention Ollie because he does great work. And Ollie apparently asked him, are you aware of what's going up with the J Gunsmoke launch? And he said, no. And he goes, well, the U.S. Army put it out on its website that it was happy to reveal that Rocket Lab is launching these targeting satellites, because there was more than one. There was a constellation, as they're called, of, I believe, 30, for redundancy purposes. And Nash had no clue. This guy signed off without knowing what was in the nose cone. And so, again, I think the commercial imperatives have outweighed, I won't say common sense, but have outweighed the natural caution we should have for signing up to other people's military ventures. And so hopefully the government will re-examine its policies. And I would simply say to RocketLab, we need to know beforehand what you're putting on the top of that booster, and we have the right of refusal. If you don't like it, the Americans are there to help you out, but they can help you out on their shores, not ours.
Yeah, sounds good too. And just in closing, thank you for your company today, Paul, and going through all of this and analysing and making sense for it. It's extremely good. With respect to the multilateral elements and the next phase and your view of what needs to be done, certainly from the point of view of New Zealand, I remember Helen Clark, in response to a question I put to her former New Zealand Prime Minister, Helen Clark, a number of years ago now, and she says, well, no one can deny New Zealand has its credentials in that space. So there you go. We will go out with a last word from a segment in a documentary I did too many years ago now. And it's a piece where Robert Green's speaking to camera. And Robert Green is a former commander in the British Royal Navy. And his job during the Cold War was to develop the capabilities of delivering a nuclear device to explode over Leningrad. And he ended up being an anti-nuclear campaigner. So here he goes. So I'll bring it up on the screen. Thank you for your company. We'll be back around midday Thursday next week, the New Zealand time. And that's 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Daylight Saving Time on the United States Eastern board there. We look forward to your company. Until then, take care and stay safe. Here's Robert Green.
Of my work, and I had just not thought politically at all. I was a natural conservative. I was not political in terms of any rebellious thoughts about policy or anything like that. I just accepted what my leaders told me with a sense of awe and wonder, that I was actually doing what I was, and it was enough to master the drills. But then I got my target, which was a military airfield outside Leningrad, which now is St. Petersburg's civil airport. And I had a shock when I landed there in 1999 to attend a security conference and discover that it had been my target. But I did have misgivings when I was planning to strike that target. And my pilot and I both realized it was the extreme end of our range. We had no spare fuel for avoiding defences. We had to fly straight over a neutral country, Sweden, because we were going to launch in the Norwegian Sea. We were trying to keep up with the Americans then, and the Buccaneer was on the absolute stops in terms of its range to get a target in Russia. And then we had a 10 kiloton freefall bomb, which we were going to have to toss at the target and then escape low level, but we discovered we probably wouldn't have enough fuel to get back. And we had to think about that and say, do we want another target? And then we realized that they wouldn't give us another one. They told us just to get on with it. And that probably there would be nothing to come back for if we ever had to do it. Because we were setting out echelon, follow-up, tactical, strike. And that we would have therefore got into World War III Holocaust by then, and Britain would have been attacked.